Okay, per votes by the Patreon supporters over on Patreon, this overview video covers a commercial aircraft, and I figured this would be a very good time to return to the Lockheed Electra. A while ago we covered the Model 10 Electra, then the Model 12 Electra Junior, and now we will take a look at the history of the Model 14, the Super Electra. By the late 1930s, the commercial aviation world in general was accelerating at a pace that left many manufacturers struggling to keep up, particularly in the United States. The Douglas Aircraft Company had rewritten the rules with their DC-3. Airlines were thus expanding their operations and infrastructure to match this new aircraft, and passengers were beginning to expect a level of range, reliability, and comfort that would have sounded suspiciously like optimism only a decade earlier. Into this increasingly competitive arena, Lockheed would introduce the Model 14, an aircraft not merely intended as a larger Electra, but as the company's bid to challenge Douglas on its own turf. It promised more speed than the previous Electra, more seats, and, in Lockheed tradition, a healthy amount of aerodynamic refinements. But the Model 14 occupies a strange and almost paradoxical place in aviation history today. On paper, it has all of the right ingredients for success: modern all-metal construction, full feathering propellers, Fowler flaps, and enough performance to outpace almost all of its rivals. But in practice, it arrived in a market where timing was everything, and Lockheed was, unfortunately, poorly timed. Commercial success was limited, yet the design proved far too capable to just fade away quietly, and it would later on be transformed into a military aircraft that reshaped the company's fortunes. So, why the heck did they build yet another version of the Electra? Well, by the mid-1930s, Lockheed found itself in a position that was increasingly difficult to ignore. The company's Electra line of aircraft, first the Model 10 and then the smaller Model 12, had demonstrated that Lockheed could produce modern, fast, all-metal commercial transports. But these aircraft existed at the margins of a commercial landscape that was shifting rapidly towards larger and more efficient airliners. The Douglas DC-2 had not merely redefined expectations, it had effectively just reset the entire economic logic of airline operations. And then, just to make matters even more challenging for other manufacturers, it was discovered that Douglas was already working on an improved airliner, the DC-3. Any manufacturer hoping to compete in this sector now needed an aircraft that was capable of carrying more passengers, flying further, and offering a lower cost per seat mile. Now, Lockheed saw this trend clearly enough, but awareness alone did not grant the resources required to respond to it. The company was already heavily committed to existing orders for the Model 10 and Model 12 Electras, which were consuming both engineering manpower and financial capital. Designing a completely brand new 20-plus seat airliner, the sort of machine truly needed to rival Douglas, was well beyond Lockheed's financial means at the time. What the company could manage, however, was a carefully calculated enlargement of an existing design, a bigger, faster development of the Electra concept that might bridge the gap between Lockheed's ambitions and its financial reality. Thus, the Model 14 emerged not as a clean-sheet challenger to the Douglas DC-3, but as a compromise shaped by financial constraint. The essential Electra configuration remained: twin radial engines, a low-slung all-metal wing, retractable undercarriage, and the familiar twin-fin tail. The new aircraft would simply be more. More power, more seats, more internal volume, without requiring Lockheed to organize and pay a whole new engineering department just to achieve it. Scaling a known design was cheaper, faster, and far less risky than developing a fresh airframe under severe resource limitations. But it also meant that the whole thing was utterly compromised from the start and in some ways doomed to commercial failure. The company's engineering team were acutely aware that they were entering a market that was already being dominated by a benchmark aircraft, so the Super Electra needed visible and quantifiable advantages. The design therefore evolved around a handful of core goals: increased lift at lower speeds, high cruising speeds, more efficient fuel carriage, and a cabin spacious enough to at least seem competitive with the Douglas designs. One of the most consequential choices was the adoption of Fowler flaps. Now, unlike the simpler flaps of the earlier Electra variants, these extended rearwards as well as downwards, increasing wing area and dramatically improving takeoff and landing performance. Paired with the Model 14's larger and deeper fuselage, which at least eliminated the whole awkward step-over-the-wing spar arrangement of earlier Lockheed models, the aircraft promised a refinement in passenger experience that Lockheed had not previously been able to offer. Specifically, a more comfortable cabin, and hopefully a far more comfortable takeoff and landing experience. This was further aided with integral fuel tanks that were built directly into the wings, which further freed up internal space at the bottom of the fuselage and reduced the sort of maintenance complications associated with the older tank systems of the previous designs. Another choice that was made in the pursuit of sales wherever they could be found was to design the aircraft to accommodate a range of engines. This way, the Model 14 could be tailored to different customers, both commercial, private, or corporate. As such, Lockheed planned for a whole family of submodels from the start. This included the Hornet-powered 14-H, the Cyclone-powered export versions, and the progressively uprated G-Series Cyclone versions that were intended for private and long-range customers. There were also some external changes, as wind tunnel experiments and later flight testing of prototypes pushed the aircraft to a slightly more aerodynamic profile. The twin fins were also enlarged compared with the previous Electras, and the balanced rudders and elevators of later production examples were already in discussion as the first prototype took shape. The prototype itself, registered X17382, rolled out at Burbank in the summer of 1937. Its first flight on the 29th of July, with Marshall Heedle at the controls, demonstrated exactly what the company had hoped to achieve. The aircraft was fast, responsive, and it showed none of the unfortunate temperament that sometimes accompanied ambitious design changes. Despite the reservations that airlines would later on adopt, the prototype itself made an excellent first impression. Lockheed wasted little time in pushing the aircraft towards commercial service. Northwest Airlines, the initial launch customer in theory, if not ultimately in practice, took delivery of the first production example in September of 1937. The type then entered service, somewhat prematurely, in October, several weeks before the formal certification was actually issued. This was the same pattern that Lockheed had followed with the Model 10, and in both cases the company had seemed quietly confident that the approval would follow without drama. Unfortunately, this time, not long after approval was given and the aircraft was certified, there was drama. On the 10th of January 1938, barely 6 weeks into official commercial service, Northwest Airlines Flight 2 crashed near Bozeman, Montana, killing all 10 people aboard. After examining the wreckage, it was found that both of the rudders and large sections of the vertical tail fins were missing from the crash site, and investigations later deduced that the tail assembly had failed due to a severe case of flutter after the aircraft had encountered turbulence. For Lockheed, this was wholly unexpected, as testing that had been done by Lockheed before it had been certified had not identified flutter as a severe risk at all. This was not simply a test of them fudging the data on this either, because the equipment that had been used to test for any flutter had been authorized and certified by the Civil Aeronautics Authority, which was the precursor to the modern-day FAA. However, it was later discovered that the machine that they had been using to measure the natural resonance of these parts had been providing misleading results. Renewed testing with new equipment quickly confirmed that flutter was an issue with the rudders, and all Model 14s were grounded until the design flaw was corrected. After this poor start, things didn't really improve for the Model 14, at least not domestically, with a single exception. In 1938, Howard Hughes took delivery of a specially modified Model 14 for a planned circumnavigational flight. In cooperation with Hughes, Lockheed had modified this aircraft for both speed and endurance. The cabin windows were largely eliminated to reduce structural drag. Additional fuel tanks filled much of the interior cabin, taking total capacity from 644 to 1,844 US gallons of fuel. Advanced radios were installed, and emergency supplies and flotation bags were provided in case of an emergency landing. Indeed, the aircraft was so crammed full of equipment and stuff that its takeoff weight was the equivalent to 226% of its empty weight. This was beyond its safety certification, and this required a special dispensation to be given, and it had to be registered as an experimental aircraft. Still, despite its bulk, this machine was powered by a pair of 1,100 horsepower Wright Cyclones, so it still got off the ground. Hughes and his crew took off on the 10th of July 1938. Their successful flight was completed in 91 hours and 14 minutes and covered approximately 14,800 miles. It wasn't a true circumnavigation as far as the record keepers saw it, as the aircraft circled the northern hemisphere and covered a distance that was less than the total length of the Tropic of Cancer, which is 22,858 miles. But it was still good enough to earn them the Collier Trophy for their achievements, and the flawless performance of the Super Electra earned it some much-needed attention, both domestically and internationally, but especially domestically because things were not looking good. Its commercial service life had gone from bad to worse. Lockheed was struggling to secure sales, and its only major customer was preparing to dump it. 3 out of the 11 aircraft that were delivered to Northwest Airlines were lost in the first 15 months of operations. Though only one accident, the first, was attributed to a design flaw in the aircraft itself, public confidence was sensitive, and these early misfortunes did a lot of damage to the Super Electra's reputation. The type was only operated by Northwest for about 18 months before they decided to dispense with the entire fleet and switch over to the Douglas DC-3. The Super Electra was so unpopular that before the Second World War, only 3 other single Model 14 aircraft were used in commercial service within the United States. For Lockheed, this complete lack of commercial domestic interest was a disaster. On paper, the Model 14 had offered promise. It was comfortable, it offered a spacious cabin, and it was fast. With cruising speeds of at least 215 miles an hour, it was faster than both the Douglas DC-2 and the DC-3. But this speed advantage had arisen because Lockheed was working with a smaller airframe, a result of the aforementioned compromise of upgrading an existing design. And this small airframe could only accommodate 12 to 14 passengers, compared to the 21 to 28 passenger capacity that was being offered by the Douglas DC-3. A smaller capacity, combined with powerful and thirsty engines, meant that the Model 14 had approximately the same operating costs as a DC-3 while carrying significantly fewer paying passengers. In short, Lockheed had gambled on a compromise, and they had completely missed the mark. However, it is not all doom and gloom. While the Model 14 struggled to secure a lasting foothold in the airline market of the United States, its reception abroad proved noticeably more encouraging. Outside the US, the aircraft encountered operators whose needs, route structures, and fleet strategies aligned more comfortably with what Lockheed had built. The result was a modest but more appreciative clientele that was scattered across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. KLM was among the first significant early operators. The Dutch airline purchased Wright-powered 14W variants, receiving its first example in February of 1938. These Super Electras were used both on European services and on the demanding colonial routes that were linking the Netherlands to the Dutch East Indies. For KLM, the aircraft's speed and reliability offered advantages on long overwater stages where pure seating capacity mattered less than performance, reliability, and endurance. In Asia, Japan's interest in the Model 14 proved even more consequential. Japan Air Transport acquired its first Model 14 in March of 1938. Quickly impressed, Japan requested and was granted licensed production, with manufacturing rights being sent to Kawasaki. Although this Japanese derivative, which became known as the Ki 56, was modified, lengthened, and adapted for military cargo use, its lineage remained unmistakably tied to the original Super Electra. This would later lead to more than a little bit of confusion during the Second World War, when both sides of the conflict operated aircraft that were derived from the same base airframe. Latin America also provided service for several Model 14s. TACA, for example, purchased the original prototype rather than allowing it to be sold into Northwest Airlines service. Operating in Central America, where infrastructure varied wildly and route economics differed very much from those of the United States, the Super Electra's combination of speed and manageable size made it an attractive regional transport. Other aircraft soon found their way into service with airlines and agencies across South America, where the mixed terrain routes often favored the smaller and faster machines over the larger capacity types that were dominating the skies back in the United States. Despite all the geopolitical rumbling, there was even interest coming from Eastern Europe. LOT, Polish Airlines, acquired Model 14s shortly before the outbreak of war, intending to modernize parts of its own domestic fleet. The deteriorating political situation prevented sustained service, but the procurement itself was another good indicator of the aircraft's value overseas. Now, individually, all of these overseas orders and service fleets were modest, but collectively they revealed that the Super Electra was not a fundamentally unmarketable aircraft as it was in the US. Rather, it was unsuited to the specific commercial ecosystems of the United States, where the DC-3's capacity advantage rendered most other competitors uneconomical. Abroad, on long colonial routes, regional networks, and national airlines operating under different priorities, the Model 14 found operators who appreciated what it offered, even if it didn't offer the absolute best profit margins. As military demand escalated in the lead-up to the Second World War, several civilian aircraft were diverted or sold into government service. Now, one of these carried British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain back to London, having signed the Munich Agreement, which he would proclaim as bringing peace in our time, which would age about as gracefully as a pint of milk sitting in the Australian outback. In summer. As the war clouds loomed closer, despite the enthusiastic waving of pieces of paper, more Model 14s were repurposed for transport, training, or liaison duties. Its speed and handling were widely praised in these roles, particularly among the British, and it is here that the true success of the Super Electra finally emerges. If the Model 14 could be said to struggle to secure its place among commercial airlines, it found a far more enthusiastic reception in military circles. The British Purchasing Commission, keenly aware of Europe's deteriorating political climate, arrived in the United States in 1938 with an urgent requirement for a modern general reconnaissance aircraft. Lockheed, sensing an opportunity that might salvage the Super Electra's fortunes, presented a militarized mock-up that was designated the B-14. It was basically a re-engined variant of the Cyclone-powered export model, with provisions for defensive armament, internal bomb storage, and a dedicated navigation station. The RAF's initial reaction wasn't enthusiastic, but it also wasn't dismissive. The layout was good, but it needed refinement, particularly the placement of the navigator and the configuration of the nose armament. Yet they agreed that the underlying airframe showed considerable promise. With recommended alterations, which included a glazed nose, twin forward-firing guns, and a more capable bolt-and-pull turret, the design evolved into what would become the Lockheed Hudson Mark I. The prototype first flew in December 1938, and deliveries began remarkably soon afterwards, in February of 1939. Once in service, the Hudson proved vastly more successful than its civilian predecessor. Its speed, range, and sturdy handling made it well suited to maritime patrol, convoy escort, and light bombing roles. The aircraft became an essential asset to the RAF's Coastal Command in the early war years, and it was subsequently produced in large numbers for both Commonwealth and US forces across several progressively improved variants. In total, nearly 3,000 Hudsons were eventually built. In an irony that Lockheed likely appreciated more than they admitted, the Model 14 achieved its greatest success not as an airliner, but as the foundation for one of the most significant Allied light military aircraft of the Second World War. Commercially, it was a letdown. Yes, some early accidents hadn't helped its reputation, but overall its design was sound. It just wasn't the best. It arrived in a market already transformed by the DC-3, and no amount of aerodynamic sophistication could overcome the simple economics that favoured the larger Douglas transports. As always, thank you all so much for watching. And a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters and YouTube members who help keep this channel going. Now, this video was meant to be up a couple of weeks ago with the other Christmas uploads, but I found an error and had to re-record a fairly large section of it when I got back from my holiday. But it is online and here at last, making it my unintended first video for 2026. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier supporters, our highest tier members, and a warm welcome to Gilles Vollers, Voltage 3, and Scott Lockhart, who are the newest members of this special group. Now, some big videos are in production at the moment, but I also have some modest ones in the pipeline as well, so I'm hoping there won't be any massive gaps in the upload schedule this year, but time will tell. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the pinned comment below, and if you've made it this far and you enjoy what you see, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. But that is all for today. Thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.